Thank you for joining us for another Hagley History Hangout. My name is Gregory Hargreaves, Assistant Director of the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware. Now, as you know, during these history hangouts, we like to bring you some of the great work being done by scholars who have used the resources held in the Hagley Library, especially scholars who have received support in the form of research grants and fellowships of different kinds from the Hagley Center. One such scholar joins me today. Maia Müller is PhD candidate at the University of Lausanne. Maia, thanks for speaking with me today.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. Let's start by painting with broad strokes, so to speak. What is it that you are researching and writing about?
Of course. So I just started my third year of my PhD. I'm doing it at the University of Lausanne, as you said, under the directory of Professor Thomas David and Professor Neil Rawlings of the University of Glasgow. And basically, what I'm looking at is the role played by international business associations in process of regulating multinational corporations in the 1960s to the 1990s. So basically, during those decades, there were lots of attempts to regulate the activities of multinational corporations. For example, at the UN, at the United Nations, in the European Community, in the International Labour Office, they all drew up codes of conduct targeting various actions of multinational corporations in the idea of putting up a framework around these corporations. And what I'm looking at is how international business associations reacted to these attempts at regulating multinational corporations. So I have four main IBAs, international business associations, that I look at, and these four are the International Chamber of Commerce, the International Organization of Employers, the Business and Industry Advisory Committee to the OECD, and the UNICEA, Union des Industries de la Communauté Européenne. And the idea is that each one of these IBA is like linked to one of the international organizations that try to regulate multinationals at this time. And I look at the way they reacted and how they coordinated a response.
What, for those of us ignorant, what is a multinational corporation and why did they present a challenge that seemed to need solving in this time?
That's a very good question. Actually, as a fun anecdote, the United Nations and the committees that were charged with drawing up a code of conduct never got together on agreeing on a definition of multinational corporations. But basically, what they said is that it's a corporation that is active in more than one country. Is it public owned, private owned, in the sense of could a Soviet corporation, for example, at the time, also be a multinational? Were questions that were points of discussions, obviously. Um, in my definition, it's any kind of corporation that is active in more than one country. And starting from the 1960s, we have a wave of decolonization, as you know, and all these new countries realize in some way that, well, now they are politically independent, but economically they are not, because corporations, often from the former colonial states, were still active, still had access to the natural resources and so on, and they were just in a unbalanced kind of relationship. And so there were various discussions starting at the UN, for example, on the new international economic order, or on just broad conferences on development and equal access to development. And multinational corporations are like core of the problem, you know, how can a newly found country compete with such big corporations? And so, especially after a series of scandals regarding US multinationals, for example, ITT in Chile in 1972, there were always more public and political pressure on corporations. And so in 1972, the UN passed a resolution asking for the formation of a group of eminent persons that had to study the ways in which the United Nations could respond and take over this challenge of multinationals. And what they came up with is the creation of a commission on transnational corporations and a center for transnational corporations at the UN. And one of these tasks were to write a code of conduct. And it's a bit of the same process in the other international organizations. with the exceptions that, for example, at the OECD, the balance of power, let's say it's very different because it's only Western rich countries. And in fact, the code was never meant, the guidelines in this case were never meant to be, like strict and hence it was more, what's the name? When it's not, the name will come back to me.
Like,
Binding, or
yes.
non-binding guidelines, exactly. That's one of
Mhm.
the big questions also. Do you do a code of conduct that is binding or is self-regulation enough? And that's a whole other topic.
Well, then, in general, what are you finding? How did these business organizations react to these attempts to, to try to rein in the influence and power of multinationals?
Well, the IBAs are in the position of defending the interests of multinationals. What is interesting is that in these decades, especially 70s and 80s, you see really for me at least, a change in the relationships between multinational corporations, traditional forms of business representations like IBAs, and international organizations. And that's why I choose to focus on this specific topic because to me it's really a good lens through which see these changes in their relationships. What I mean by that is that, for example, international business associations do not only represent multinational corporations, but during these decades, multinational corporations took on so much importance that the internal balance in these IBAs was changed. So the room that the multinationals took became always bigger. And international business associations had to adapt to this growing role of multinationals. And one of the questions is, well, how did they do it? Did they manage to do it? And do this have any kind of implication and impact on their relationships, for example, between the ICC and the International Organization of Employers, for example? At the same time, you have international organizations that do need these official channels of business representations to bring legitimations to their process because it's not like they say, oh, multinationals are completely bad and we don't want their impulse on anything. No, they want to know, like, how could this aid development? How can we bring transfer of technology to any country, for example? So it's not like they ban multinationals from the discussions. On the contrary, that's a whole other topic. Like how do the people you try to regulate must have a seat at the table. And so international business associations, what they do is that they bring legitimacy to both actors in a sense, because for the multinational corporations, they are the official channels of representation. So it's not like there's one corporation that says, oh, I don't agree with this project and I am opposed to it. They all come together to say, we don't agree and we propose to you something else. So this is a kind of way of legitimizing your message, bringing it to this official channel of representation. And on the other hand, for the IOs, they have these official partners through which they can communicate with private business because at the end of the day, that's it. So these international organizations also need these IBAs to have a dialogue and to listen to all the different points of view. What the IBAs do to defend multinational corporations is be present, bring a lot of info, and bring a lot of papers and like just any kind of documentation on what a multinational actually is, how do they work, what are the benefits, what could be the problems, etc., to the people at the IOs charged with regulating them. Uh, I can really see how closely they work together. So it's not usual that these different business representatives work so closely because I mean in the end they do kind of the same work, but they had traditional areas of representations. And for on this topic, they all come together, and that's really the interesting thing to see that they have joint committees. You find a lot of the same persons on all the different committees, and they exchange information a lot. They prepare official positions, they respond, and you can see how they take up contact with political representatives, for example, before negotiations in the international organizations.
So, what is it that put Hagley on your radar, and what did you come here to look at?
So I I would like to do an international story. Obviously, it's more of a Western one, because the countries and the business representatives that were most active were the Western ones defending their interests. And so I so far have looked at all the countries where I could understand the language. So I'm from Switzerland. I went to Switzerland, to France, to Great Britain and Germany and so on, Belgium. And the American business was, and the US business was obviously very important. They play a very active role. They are very vocal. Some of the biggest multinationals are based in the US. So obviously, it was very important for me to have access to the archives of US business associations. The thing is, the four IBAs I mentioned to you don't have centralized archives that are accessible to the public.
Mm.
That's why I go to these different countries to go through the archives of the national federations to get access to the documents, because otherwise, uh, or they are closed or they are like never responding. And so otherwise, I wouldn't get access to these archives. So at Hagley, I looked at the archives of four US business associations, the National Associations of Manufacturers, the United States Council of the ICC, the Chamber of Commerce of the United States, and the National Foreign Trade Council, because in some ways they all took positions on this question of multinationals and regulations in these decades. And so it was fundamental, and there was a huge collection of documents for me. It was a very fruitful research. And for example, the kind of documents that I find are minutes of meetings, official documents from the main IBA. You know, for example, the ICC will write to all of its members, and therefore I will find these minutes in the archives of the United States Council of the ICC. You have memos, briefings, programs of actions, program of conferences, letters, articles. Also, that helps me to get a sense of how present the topic was in press, for example. You have official brochures in which they say all the actions that they've done in 1972, for example, which also gives me an idea of, well, what's the balance between their actions for multinationals and actions for other kind of businesses they represent. So that's the kind of document I'm looking at to get a sense of, well, who takes part in their meetings, what are they talking about, and how do they talk about it. And through these documents and the minutes of these meetings, I can see when they feel threatened by an action, if there's a sense of urgency, also in the frequency of the meetings, or I can see if they are kind of relaxed, saying, I don't think this code will get through and it's going to be okay. Basically, that's what I look at.
Hmm. Well, that seems sort of a blessing and a curse because that is such a huge volume of material, and you're able to, of course, use it as you see fit. But it's also a challenge to sort of process that much. So, how do you sort of face that situation?
I read a lot. But no, it's jokes aside, it's definitely a challenge. But I think it's the novelty of my research in a sense. It's because the IBAs have been studied so far, obviously, but case studies have mostly been on one IBA or one nation or one international organization, but not yet really looking at the networks formed by these international business associations. And for me, it's really this opportunity that I want to take on and these questions I want to try to answer. And so far, it's been okay. Now we will see if I get completely lost in the 2 years I have left. But I think the importance is also not to get lost in the details. I mean, you can read without and get a sense of the urgency or the lack of that they feel, but you don't have to memorize every kind of detail. It's really interesting to see, for example, when a country reacts different, well, a country, when businessmen of one country react differently than businessmen of another country, or when you can see that um, they go over the small national differences to get a common opinion on one question. I mean, it all brings a more sensitive picture of IBAs rather than like a monolith defending their own interests, like and as if every business interest was the same, you know. I think that's the interesting question as well, is to see, well, how do they go over their differences to actually find a common front, which, for example, IOs didn't do. They didn't cooperate on like putting forward one kind of regulation for multinationals, they all stick with theirs. Well, whereas business representatives manage to get a common opinion together.
Mhm. Mhm. Now, sort of on that basis of sort of patterns in the documents, were there certain uh, countries, business communities, or perhaps certain sectors that were more vocal in their defense of the multinational, or perhaps the converse, the reverse, more vocal in their opposition, their attempts to control multinational influence?
Well, so far, I mean, every business associations I've seen so far has been quite vocal in their opposition to any kind of regulation
Hmm.
and in pushing forward non-binding regulation. So South Code of Conduct, social responsibility, but for like the individual enterprises and not on an international level. Um, US business representatives are putting a lot of energy in all these efforts, but Switzerland as well. And for example, Swiss multinationals like Nestle are very active on different fronts to even produce information on multinationals. They finance a lot of research to produce another kind of narrative on multinationals. The response of Swiss businessmen and chiefs of Swiss multinationals has been studied by one of my colleagues, Sabine Pitlou, and she has written a book really on how like a handful of multinationals got together informally, had direct contact to the government, pushing against any attempt of regulation. I mean, it's a big thing. You can really feel their stress, especially at the beginning of the 70s, because I think they feel attacked from every front. There are lots of articles. There are one in the press attacking multinationals, so just questioning them at this point. You have one scandal after the other. In Switzerland, for example, there's a scandal around baby milk, baby powder milk around Nestle. So it's those are big things, you know. And in the US, there are the Church Commission, looking at the scandals of ITT that we mentioned before and everything. So I think they really feel like they're under a lot of pressure, and the quicker they react and the most forcefully they react, the better. And so, in terms of sectors, I don't see any sector that comes forward more than the other. It's more like, oh, you have some multinationals that are more present than the others. For example, Nestle, as we mentioned, Unilever is very, very active. But it's also because some years one of their CEO is, for example, the president of the ICC, and therefore he's going to be in all the meetings, you know. But I mean, for example, the companies that I saw most at Hagley's are Caterpillar, IBM, Procter and Gamble, Union Carbide, General Motors. So you see, those are sectors that are actually all quite different, but they are united in, well, we are multinationals, and we therefore are targeted by our being multinationals.
Hmm. Mhm. How might I know you're still in the midst of it, but how might your project speak to the contemporary moment, to our present moment?
That's the whole big question, no? I think that one of my main reflection is that the role of lobbying in international organizations is not thought about enough. It has been studied a lot, for example, now at the European Parliament. So it is a subject. Obviously, I'm not claiming that I'm inventing the study on lobbying. Absolutely not. For example, what do we do with private interests that have an official seat in international organizations? You know, I don't claim to have the answer, but I think it's a question worth looking at. And one of the things now, for example, is that at the UN, they are still trying to do a code of conduct on multinational corporations. I think there are something like the 51st session of the group of work on the working group on this topic. And there is no mention of the work that has been done during almost 20 years, from 74 to 92, on trying to write a code of conduct, you know, but the business interests are still there. And so to me, it's kind of mind-boggling to think that there is no consideration of on all of this story that already exists, and what has been written on the United Nations Center for Transnational Corporations, for example, is it's very interesting and very precious to give an idea of the work that has been done and the scope of the work, but it's more an institutional story, and the voices from the business actors are missing because you can't find them in the UN archives, obviously. And so I think for the current moment, it would bring maybe, I hope, some kind of awareness to the side voices that are very active, but that you can't find if you only look at the regulators, you know. And I think it's also a moment where corporate social responsibility really becomes the norm, because before that you don't really see all this self code of conduct from individual corporations, but they really come forward at this period also to defend themselves. You know, you're like, oh well, we don't need a code of conduct, or we don't need a binding code of conduct because we already have our own. And I'm not saying that it's bad, but maybe it's worth looking at why they started doing this. What was the momentum when they started doing this? And maybe somebody else can ask the question of, does it work? So I hope that it will find some kind of resonance, because I think it's important. But basically, I also think that it's the occasion to look at international business associations as very important actors of global governance and of having like a fundamental role in the political process that we are analyzing. But there are secret actors, because the examples I gave to you before of like access to archives is a problem. You know, like
Mhm.
we don't know what they do. And so far, when I've been talking to my friends, like, hey, do you know the International Chamber of Commerce? No, nobody does, except like we historians of business history who study really precise thing. But if you talk like to people who are not doing this, they are still being touched by actions of this private interest, but we don't really know what they do, how they function, and what they do on a daily basis. So I hope that I can shed some light on some of their actions just to highlight their importance and remember that there are actors that we should take into consideration.
Mhm. I think you're absolutely right, and that's a really important message.
Thank you.
Mhm. Well, Maya, thank you so much for sharing your work, and I can't wait to read your dissertation when you're all done.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. And for the audience, if you would like more Hagley History Hangouts, more information on the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library, join us online. You can visit hagley.org. That's HAGLEY.org. Don't be a stranger.